Welcome, everyone. You're watching the Global Unites webinar series. Today, I have the privilege of having a dear friend of Global Unites and myself, Indi Samarajiva. He's a blogger, entrepreneur, a journalist, and he's been a friend and a resource person for the movement for many years. Indi, thank you for joining us this morning.
Hey, Prashant, thank you.
So we want to talk to you mainly about COVID-19 and what's going on around the world, especially in Sri Lanka's context. You were one of the first people to start writing about it, talking to the public on how we should respond and not take this lightly. And so I thought it'd be interesting to pick your brains because you've been following this very closely. One quick question to start off with is, did we see this coming? Well, at one point, it was just limited to the Hubei province in China. At that point, was it possible to know that it would snowball into this global lockdown and become this massive pandemic? Or, did this catch everybody by surprise?
So honestly, I think you and I didn't see this coming, but people in East Asia and experts around the world have seen this coming. So, I mean, the question is why you should listen to me about any of this. So I'll say you don't have to. A lot of this information is publicly available now. So what I'll reference throughout this is something called covidtranslate.org, which is sort of direct translation of the Korean government's documents concerning this pandemic. And places like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the places that have responded well, that's not because they have like different or better cultures than us. It's actually because they dealt with things like SARS and MERS, which are also coronaviruses. And they wrote legislation, they set up institutions, they did a lot of planning starting over 15 years ago. So people definitely saw this coming because what you saw happen in those countries was a very rapid political immune system kick in, which was institutions they built and funded over actually decades. And pandemics, to be honest, there's a show on Netflix you can watch called Pandemic, which was filmed before all this happened. And in that, every single expert says it's just a matter of when, not if. So every single epidemiologist, every single researcher, every single virologist, they've all been saying this is going to happen. But I mean, to be honest, like climate change, a lot of us haven't been listening. But one broader lesson here is that, yes, you and I may not have seen this coming. Our political leaders definitely see this coming, but people did see this coming. And we should have, and we could have listened to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that it has happened and it's become something that we've never experienced in our lifetime, where the entire world has been held hostage by this, how are we going to adapt to the new norm? What's life going to be like? How do responsible citizens in countries in the developing world like ours now respond to the situation?
So the new norm for us is where East Asia has been since 2003. So after SARS, you suddenly saw there's a lot of mask wearing in those countries, which we in the rest of the world have tended to laugh at or say it's not necessary, but it actually helps. There have been robust laws passed. There have been institutions set up in those countries. They're actually, epidemic concern is a part of their cultures now. And we've looked at that and seen it's a cultural thing, but it's actually an institutional thing. So all of our cultures have to change now. So in Sri Lanka, you can see that the president, who, like him or not, whatever, I do think the fact that he wears masks and that government officials now wear masks in every photo, that shows a big cultural shift. And that's a sort of institutional normal that has to come in now. We have to change how our countries function in order to deal with epidemics now. For example, international travel. I do think for the longest time, international travel has been based on the power and the wealth of your country. But what you can see in the future, perhaps, is that it'll be based on your health systems. So how much screening do you have on this side that enables you to get on a flight? How much preparation you had, how much you were able to suppress this virus in the first place. So I think we'll see a global cultural, right now, look, it's all up in the air and institutions can actually snap back worse. But if you look at the countries that did it in East Asia after SARS, their culture changed so that they were more culturally able to fight epidemics in the future. So that's the logical thing to do. People can always be worse.
Okay. So when it comes to evaluating how different governments have responded to this, you can see a extreme the differentiation from a Chinese version where there was an absolute, almost militant lockdown of Wuhan especially. And then you have, the British trying herd immunity. And But if you could evaluate each of these different things that have happened, what would it be? How would you analyze it, and how would you rate each of these performances? And what would be a model worth following at this stage for our countries?
So with something like this, the number one factor is time. So the response you take when you have, say, 10 cases is very different from the response you take when you have 100 or 1,000. So the countries that went into lockdown, the main commonality there is they just waited too late. So if you wait until you have 1,000 cases, then you essentially have to quarantine everyone, the sick and healthy. And it's a very draconian response. Whereas the countries that started earlier, so like say Taiwan is right next to China, huge amounts of movement, especially during the Lunar New Year, but they never actually locked down normal civilians there. And that's because they kicked in an immune response much earlier. So they started screening, testing, quarantining. The basic toolkit for fighting an epidemic, I think, has been the same since 1918. They didn't have testing so much, but now it's test, isolate, trace. And you just keep repeating that. You find the sick, you isolate them, you trace your contacts. You find the sick, you trace their contacts. You just keep doing that over and over. But as you can see, so I've talked to some people at the CMC who are doing contact tracing now. So they were looking for one contact. That one contact ended up having like 50 people that they have had to trace. So if you suddenly have 100 people, then you have 5,000 people you have to trace, right? And if you have 1,000 people, then it's immediately you can't trace it anymore. And you have to just say, okay, we assume everyone's infected, everyone locked down. So the countries, the main differentiator is time. So the countries that fought this well, yes, they definitely had institutions, but the main thing the institutional capacity gave them was the ability to respond on day one. So there's a lot of research that shows basically like if you respond 2 days later, you can have 40% more deaths or a very large percentage more deaths. I'd reference that study somewhere. So in this thing, days matter, hours matter. So the countries that respond faster are the ones that do better. And to be honest, it's not the countries you'd expect. So I would say the East Asian countries have done the best. And then next after that, I would say, honestly, the African countries have done really well. The places that had experience with Ebola, places like Senegal, their response is far ahead of like the UK. And okay, this is my personal opinion, but I think the Western powers have been very arrogant. They thought that this wouldn't happen to us. In the US, the Trump administration destroyed all their preparation, and they defunded all of their infrastructure. And they just acted like, oh, we're rich and we're great and this will never happen to us. But it's obviously happening to everyone. And there's a quote, it's how to say, luck favors the prepared mind. So in this case, some people have said, oh, these places got lucky or they did cancel flights. It's not that. It's that they were prepared. So the countries that have been prepared have been the ones that came ahead.
Yeah, I think I really agree with the point that countries that have experienced it before have had reason to be more prepared, especially East Asia. And I was just in West Africa for Global Unite's work, and I was amazed at Liberia and Sierra Leone and their response, because they had been frightened once by Ebola that swept through the country. And from the time you got off the plane, you were washing your hands at every second. You went through about 4 or 5 screens before you finally got to immigration.
Yeah, you were telling me that. Like, so in the US and UK, they just like give you a questionnaire, right? Like, so the African response that you experienced is better.
Yeah. And so how are countries like ours in the developing world going to respond to this issue of our diaspora or our migrant workforce who find themselves in the West right now, who kind of came back into the country? We saw that between the 1st of March to the 9th of March, we had an influx of Sri Lankans in Italy show up. And we're seeing that in Afghanistan, people across the border from Iran walking back in. We're seeing it in Uganda, coming through Dubai, back to Uganda. And all these cases for us in the developing world are coming back from migrant workers or the diaspora. What sort of healthy policies can governments come up with to try and stop this spread that's coming in from those parts of the world right now?
So that's what countries in East Asia are dealing with now, whereas they suppressed the virus to some degree, and then suddenly people started coming back and they got like a second wave. So for that, even what they're adopting, and again, I don't know exactly the best practice here, but they're doing a 14-day quarantine for everyone that comes in. So if you fly into Korea, you have to download an app, and that app essentially tracks you, and you have to report your temperature twice a day, or they get an alert and people show up at your door. And you're assigned a public health official basically from the time you come in. Now, Korea does self-quarantine. So you're expected to quarantine yourself. They've still had people from the West mainly, I think from Poland and the UK, who've gone out and like played golf and like done dumb stuff like that. but generally you're trusted. They use education and some sort of end tracking to maintain a self-quarantine. For Sri Lanka, we've obviously had problems with that. So my wife and kid came back from England, basically on the last flight that you could come back on, and we self-quarantined. But the family pressure to just, see people and to like just exchange food or like do traditional Sri Lankan things, that all pushes against self-quarantine. And because we're not a country that's experienced SARS or experienced MERS, we, like when the tsunami struck, right? There was that joke going around that like, oh, who's T tsunami? That our government sent someone to pick them up at the airport. We didn't know what a tsunami was. So now we know, but I think the simplest policy is what we're doing now is if you get off a flight, you get quarantined for 14 days. And that also has its weaknesses. And so if Sri Lanka had done that 2 weeks earlier, which would have been before my wife came back, but if they'd done that 2 weeks earlier, then we would have had much less cases now. But then think about what that does to international travel, right? Let's say you want to go for a wedding, right? You got 3-day wedding, you got 14 days quarantine on one side, 14 days quarantine on another side. You might as well like take a boat,
International travel, 1 month of quarantine plus 3 days or whatever you came to do.
Yeah.
So hopefully that doesn't become our norm in the years to come. But
I think the norm would become like, let's say someone from Korea, right? Right now, a traveler from Korea, people shut their borders to Korea, but maybe they shouldn't have, because Korea was running a good testing regime. That by the time someone's gotten into a Korean flight, they've had their temperature taken like 4 times, and they would have been like certified in some way. So I do think countries we have to start opening up. But I do think the countries can start opening up, saying, okay, we have this testing regime in place. This person, like to travel to Africa, you have to get or Kenya, you have to get the yellow fever vaccination. So you'll have to get some sort of certification in order to move. But for right now, people just have to use the blunt instrument of a 14-day quarantine for every arrival.
Yeah, I think in 14 days, even if you don't show a temperature, if this is going to be asymptomatic for 80% of the population, that's not going to work either. So you have to do the 14 days as of now until they come up with a vaccine. But talking about the economic impact, okay, tourism's down the drain, not just for our country, but around the world. And it might be so for quite a long time. What sort of economic impact? I don't think we've ever started comprehending how big of a blow this is going to be for our economies. So would you like to unpack that for us?
It's terrible. So for developing countries, there's 2 impacts. One is just our local economies shut down. So daily wage earners, just normal economic activity shuts down, which is what everyone in the world experiences. But we have a second whammy, I guess, in that we are generally indebted. So we generally have debt, which is denominated usually in dollars. And because our export economy is shut down, no one needs, so our exchange rate is based on someone needs to come and buy rupees in order to buy clothes, or they need to come and buy rupees in order to buy like tea. And that all shuts down. And we stop getting foreign exchange from workers in the Middle East also. So that puts tremendous pressure on our currency. So our currency in Sri Lanka, the currency is now 200 rupees to $1. I think that's the selling rate, which is more than it's ever been. And what that means, so look, for me personally, I actually earn in dollars on Medium. I earned 50,000 rupees more for the month of March because of the currency fluctuation, which is a significant amount for me as a person. But then translate that to a country, that means we're owing billions of more dollars. So suddenly we have this epidemic that we need to fight, and we're not like Western countries, right? We can't print money. The US is probably the most irresponsible country in the world right now, but they can still just pull $2 trillion out of nowhere and it counts as money. If we do that, we get inflation and people can't buy food. So I do think for developing countries, something that people aren't talking, well, some people are talking about it. There's actually some groups asking for this, but we need debt. I say debt cancellation, but we need some sort of debt relief, because we can't keep repaying Western countries for this debt, which is only increasing, and fight this epidemic at the same time. And frankly, that's not in anyone's interest, because as long as this is going on anywhere in the world, everyone's in danger.
Yeah. So talking about these economic realities, and how do you find the balance? I'm sure there are quite a few people writing about this now as well. The balance of the health of a nation and the ensuring that the economy is not totally flatlining, or maybe someday that the economy is thriving. What does that look like? And who's doing it well right now?
So I think there's this argument which is started from America, which is that, oh, we have to decide, or in the UK, which is the worst people to take advice from, but that like, oh, we have to like balance the economy and health. And there's no such thing. These two things are like one thing. An economy is just people and their activities, and people are health. If we're dying or if we're sick, there is no economy. So it's not like, oh, it's not like we can say, oh, okay, ignore that pile of dead bodies in the corner, like go to a restaurant. That's not going to happen. Like you have to take care of the health in order to have an economy. They're one thing. And I think so the countries that do this see this. Now you can preserve your economy by taking care of the health problem early. So if you look at places like Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, it's not like they said, okay, we're gonna let people die and preserve our economy. What they said, no, people are not going to die, therefore we're going to preserve our economy. Yeah. So what they did is they started from the beginning with preparation again. So if you start that test, isolate, trace cycle very early in the process, then you can function. So in Korea, like what happens is, let's say you're infected, right? And they have wide scale testing, so they're able to find you. And when they find you, they say, hey, Prashant, actually, they don't even say. What they do is, let's say I had coffee with you, because our phones were close to each other. They send a text message to me saying, hey, you've been close to someone who is infected, get your ass in quarantine, like self-quarantine. So they're not really asking. I have to self-quarantine. And then when I self-quarantine, they send me bags to put all my waste in. They send me food, which looks like pretty good. You get free streaming. You get cash support if your employer doesn't give it. You're protected from being fired, and you're given everything you need to self-quarantine. And then if you screw it up, then they block you. But so because they have that very rigid test, isolate, trace regime in place, they can stay open. Because you know that if a case does get loose, there's a system for catching it. Whereas we lock down because we have no system for catching it. So we just have to do a very blunt force thing, which is no, everybody's infected, everybody stay home. Mm-hmm. So you can stay open, but then it requires preparation, and not really preparation now. So all of the advice from East Asia is really like go back to 2003 and like start planning.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I just received a paper clipping from Uganda where it's a cartoon of this poor family being scared off by the coronavirus to stay at home, and being scared off by this ghost of hunger asking them to get out of the house to find food. And they're stuck there. And that's the reality for many. And for those of you who are watching, I just want to this is a quick opportunity to plug in that we are looking as Global Unites to respond to those families who are in the situation right now. You could donate, just go to our Facebook page. We're looking to raise $60,000 between the next 10 days, and we will be able to feed 5,000 families up to 840,000 meals for the next 2 weeks. It's crucial because these countries really don't have an option right now because the governments are not stable enough to provide what South Korea is providing. Indi, you want to comment on that? How will these countries get through this? In the sense of, looks like it's going to be civil society and people taking care of each other, and the global humanity coming together, taking care of each other, because governments don't have an answer in our part of the world for the crisis of hunger.
I mean, yeah, people aren't eating. So right now it just favors people that have capital. So I have a credit card, so I can buy online deliveries, right? But there's people who depend on, the 1,000, 2,000 rupees they bring home that day to buy, the rice for that day. As you know, we live in a sachet economy. So we sell, toothpaste and soap in sachets this big, because that's how much free cash flow people have. So people are going hungry. People are going on one meal a day or no meals a day. So yes, we need to step in as individuals. We have to help our neighbors. If you have any excess cash, please give it away now. This is what I think every religious prophet or anyone would tell you. And they would tell you this all the time, but just whatever you have extra, give it out now. But also the governments just have to step up and do this. Governments, because also we can't move, right? If I want to give, I can't give any further than I can give online, right? But I can't physically move anywhere. So governments have to step up. In Sri Lanka, they are doing it. As in we get basically government distributions of food around here. And the problem is governments leave a lot of people out. So there's someone named Marie Da Silva. She raises money for some of those people who are say sex workers, or we completely screwed over the people in the free trade zones, migrant labor, the people who literally prop up our countries country, in India especially, they've just been like left out to wander the streets, right? So we need to pick up the pieces where the government can't reach. Yeah. But ultimately, look, like what this crisis has showed is that we need governance. We need governments to step in at times like these. Yeah. And to be honest, we should be asking, why is anyone hungry anytime? Like, why does anyone need to go out and work or their children don't eat? Like, is that a world we need to live in? I don't think so. So I believe in universal basic income. And I think in India, like Rahul Gandhi ran on that a few years ago. But like, why is it ever like this? Like, why are people ever struggling to feed their children that day? Like, don't we have, I think throughout the world, we actually have enough. So we should consider whether people should be able to survive on any day. So if a pandemic hits, we don't like scramble and build resources. We know that people aren't going to starve.
And that's a very good way for us to close the conversation, in the sense for us, this has been a time to stop and reflect, not just about our personal lives, but about our countries and the world we live in. Have we become numb to certain realities? That there are people who are going hungry even before this pandemic. Thousands of people die, thousands of children die every day because of malnutrition. And the world has enough food to feed itself over 3 times over. And so we need to do better. And so maybe this is a good opportunity. And then for those of us who are people who are committed to serve society, want to respond, here's a time to step up, but also to inspire a broader society. That this shouldn't be a subculture society who wants to get involved and do social good, but it has to be a broader society working together and a global community coming together. So thank you for watching. Indi, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and insight. We'll continue these conversations in the weeks to come. But thank you for watching. Continue to follow more content on Global Unites. Thanks, Indi.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.